The coin of promise. Every time it was spent, something went wrong. Have you ever kept something you thought was just a lucky charm, until you realized you were dealing with something much bigger? Daniel received an ancient coin from a stranger on the road. No apparent value, no glitter, just a carved symbol, and an enigmatic phrase, "Keep it, and never exchange it for anything common." For years she brought luck, protection, open doors, but he only had to use it once to buy something trivial. And everything fell apart, job lost, relationships ruined, and the worst part? The coin always came back, as if she was exacting a price for a broken promise. If this story already gave you goosebumps, imagine what's yet to come. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and come find out why some promises can never be broken. It was a cloudy afternoon in the countryside of Minas Gerais when 16-year-old Daniel decided to take a shortcut home along the dirt road that crossed the abandoned fields of the neighboring farm. The route, though shorter, was rarely used. The silence was absolute, except for the distant sound of a rooster crowing and the wind blowing through the dry trees. It was then that, leaning against a wooden fence, Daniel saw a man. He wore old, worn clothes and had a distant look in his eyes, as if he weren't completely there. The man didn't ask for anything. He simply called him by name, even though he had never seen him before. Daniel hesitated, but approached. The wanderer extended his hand and revealed an ancient coin, carved with symbols Daniel had never seen. It was a tarnished metal, too heavy for its size, and seemed to shine even under the cloudy sky. Without saying where it came from or why he chose Daniel, the man said, "Keep it. It's worth more than it looks." And with a slight nod, he turned and walked down the road, vanishing as if dissolved into thin air. Daniel stood still for minutes. The coin was still in his hand, and for some reason, he felt like that encounter wasn't a coincidence. He put the object in his wallet and continued on his way, never imagining that that simple gesture would change the course of his life forever. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to tell what had happened, but no one took him seriously. It was just a crazy old man, they said. But something kept him from parting with the coin. Every time he touched it, a strange sense of calm and protection enveloped him. And so, unknowingly, Daniel sealed a silent pact with something that transcended common understanding. Something that, as he would later discover, refuses to be forgotten, much less exchanged for trivialities. Ever since he received that coin from the silent wanderer, Daniel carried it with him at all times. It was merely a piece of metal, darkened by time, bearing symbols he didn't recognize, a sort of serpent entwined in a circle, surrounded by small lines as if it were a lost inscription. But something about the object drew him, as if it held more than just material value. He placed it in his wallet, among his documents, and there it remained. Time passed. Daniel finished high school, entered university, and began working as an intern in a small office. Whenever he faced difficult situations, important exams, job interviews, meetings, he made a point of touching the coin first. He couldn't explain why, but he felt more confident, as if an invisible force were with him, and curiously, everything worked out. Whenever he had the coin, obstacles seemed softened, results came more easily, and even chance played in his favor. He began to call it his silent luck. Over time, Daniel began to attribute achievements both large and small to that small artifact. A teacher was absent on the day of his most dreaded test. A classmate submitted his resume without his knowledge. And one day, he won a book raffle at a fair, even though he didn't remember signing up. Too many coincidences, he thought, for there not to be. Something more involved. His friends even mocked him when he said his wallet was his personal talisman. But Daniel, though he laughed along, believed it. Curious, he researched the coin's symbolism, but the features didn't match any modern symbol. Some images resembled ancient runes, others seemed like the marks of forgotten civilizations. But he never found anything conclusive. It was as if the coin originated beyond time or stemmed from some tradition buried under centuries of oblivion. What he never questioned was the origin of that gift. The encounter with the wanderer had become a hazy memory, almost a dream. He couldn't remember the man's face, nor exactly how he'd disappeared after handing over the coin. He only remembered the words he'd said before, "Keep it, it's worth more than it seems." And so, the coin became part of his identity. Daniel came to see it as a symbol of protection, and perhaps even destiny. He didn't tell anyone how much he trusted that small object. He didn't know it, but that blind trust, that silent attachment was exactly what the coin demanded. Bond, fidelity, presence. Because although Daniel believed he carried the amulet willingly, the coin, in its cold metallic silence, carried him too. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day in Daniel's life. He was late for work, his mind wandering. In his rush, he stopped at a coffee shop and, without realizing it, handed over a different coin as part of his change. It was the old coin the drifter had given him years ago when he was still a teenager. That coin, which he had so carefully kept in his wallet, had been forgotten in that moment of distraction. But this small slip would mark the beginning of a turn of events he never imagined. The next morning, Daniel was woken by an unexpected call. It was from HR at the company he'd worked for 3 years. The voice on the other end sounded cold and matter-of-fact. "Daniel, unfortunately, we need to terminate your contract. There are inconsistencies in important files, and since they were accessed using your login, we have no alternative." Stunned, he couldn't react immediately. He clearly remembered having done everything correctly, but the documents he'd saved under his care had been corrupted, deleted, or mysteriously duplicated. He tried to defend himself, but there was no evidence to back him up. The feeling of confusion intensified when he got home. He threw his backpack on the floor, still in disbelief. He instinctively reached into his pockets and, in a mechanical gesture, pulled out a wad of keys, loose papers, and the coin. Yes, the coin was there. But how? He was sure he'd used it at the diner. He could still picture in his mind the moment it dropped onto the cashier's metal tray. And now it was back in his pocket, as if it had never left. The chill down his spine was immediate. From that day on, Daniel began to suspect something was wrong with the object. Until then, he had considered it merely a symbol of good luck, a curious amulet with emotional value. But now, something had changed. It was as if the coin had a kind of consciousness and a will of its own. In the following days, he tried to ignore the coincidence. He put the coin back in his wallet and continued looking for a new job. Curiously, he received a better offer than the last, and everything seemed to return to normal. But the pattern repeated itself. Months later, when he needed to buy a last-minute gift for a friend, he opened his wallet without thinking and used the coin again. The next day, his car tire blew out on the highway. A big scare, but no injuries. What baffled him was the exact timing of the accident, 11:11 a.m., with the same number discreetly engraved on the side of the coin. From that moment on, Daniel began keeping a detailed record. Every time he used the coin, something went wrong, and every time it disappeared, it returned to him days later. It was as if it refused to be exchanged, as if it were connected to him in a deep and at the same time punitive way. And so, without realizing it, the coin became more than an object. It became part of his routine, a constant reminder that there are things, no matter how small, that carry a promise, a debt, and that they should never, under any circumstances, be exchanged for something trivial. 3 days had passed since Daniel had unwittingly used the coin at a roadside diner. His sudden dismissal the next day still echoed like a sharp blow, but nothing could prepare him for what was to come. On a grey Monday morning, as he put on an old coat to go to the grocery store, he reached into his pocket and felt the familiar metallic chill. It was the coin, the same one, exactly the same, with the same scratches, the same weight, the same enigmatic symbol. as if it had never left his wallet. At first, he thought it was a bizarre coincidence. Maybe there was a second, similar coin. Maybe someone had paid change with an identical one. But deep down, something was screaming. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the return. The coin wouldn't go away. He decided not to tell anyone. He put the coin back in his wallet, feeling throughout the week a wave of lightness take over his life. An unexpected job offer came. A childhood friend whom he hadn't spoken to in years called just to say he missed him. A sequence of small positive events surrounded him as if the tide had turned. But the coin also became a psychological burden. He began to feel anxious every time he changed his clothes, afraid of dropping it. He began compulsively checking to see if it was still there. One time during dinner with friends, the coin disappeared for a few minutes. And at that very moment, one of their cars was broken into on the street. No one was hurt, but the feeling of warning wouldn't leave Daniel's mind. The situation worsened when he tried to leave it at home. Just for one night, he thought. He left the coin in a drawer and went out to meet an old colleague to talk about investments. Upon returning, he discovered the apartment had been broken into. Nothing had been stolen, but the coin was back in the wallet, untouched. Daniel began to understand that this wasn't just a charm, it was a bond, a promise made, even if unspoken. A pact sealed the moment he accepted that gift from the mysterious wanderer years ago. And most importantly, an agreement that wouldn't be trivialized. Whenever he used the coin, whether by mistake or distraction, the response was swift. Something bad would happen. A relationship would end without explanation. An important client would back out of a project. An electronic device would explode out of nowhere. But all it took was for the coin to return to him and things would fall into place. And the way it returned, that was the most disturbing detail. It didn't matter if the coin was left on a bus seat, thrown into a river, or purposely forgotten on a bar table. In less than 3 days, it always found its way back, inside the pocket of an old coat, at the bottom of a backpack, or even on the garage floor. It was as if the coin had a memory, as if it had a kind of sense of destiny, and he was her destiny. Or perhaps he was the flesh and blood debt she had been created to collect. At this point, Daniel no longer sought explanations. He sought control. He created a small compartment lined with coarse salt, candles, and protective symbols, and began to keep the coin there silently every night. And each time it vibrated slightly or shifted position within the box, he understood the promise was being kept, for now. But one thing was certain. In that story, he wasn't the one who owned the coin. It was the coin that owned him. Daniel began to live in a state of constant vigilance. It was no longer enough to simply carry the coin with him. He needed to be emotionally alert, spiritually shielded, and rationally alert. He knew that any carelessness with that small object could mean a complete imbalance in his life. And yet, his routine forced him to live with the coin as an inseparable part of his daily life. One random Sunday, while doing laundry, Daniel felt the coin vibrate inside his pants pocket. A slight tremor, almost imperceptible, but real. He picked it up carefully and noticed it was warm. That had never happened before. He felt a sudden dizziness, as if something inside him was being tugged by a force not of this world. In the following days, events became even stranger. He began hearing whispers at night, coming from inside his wallet. Words in an unknown language, but they sounded ancient, like prayers whispered by distant voices. One morning, he woke with the coin in his chest, even though he had kept it in the ritual safe. And that morning, he discovered that every mirror in his house was cracked in the center, with lines that formed the same symbol carved on the coin. Frightened, he sought spiritual help. An old monk from the countryside, known for dealing with cursed objects, attended to him after much insistence. Upon seeing the coin, the monk fell silent, took a deep breath, and said, "This coin is a mark of living debt. It's not yours, but it's linked to you by ancestral resonance. Someone in your lineage promised something. You are paying the price." Daniel felt as if the ground had fallen away. He questioned everything. What if his grandfather or great-grandfather had received this coin before him? What if the mysterious wanderer wasn't a stranger, but someone sent to deliver the burden to the one who would inherit the debt? The monk recommended that he leave the coin at a spiritual crossroads, a crossroads between ancient paths surrounded by earth and silence, and make a request for liberation under an eclipse. Months later, on a cold dawn, Daniel followed all the instructions. He placed the coin in a small wooden box, lit black candles, recited the words the monk had taught him, and waited. The total lunar eclipse would occur that night. At 3:33 a.m., a strong wind blew out all the candles. The box was thrown meters away, and the coin disappeared. For weeks, Daniel was at peace. No vibrations, no voices, no cracked mirrors. He began to think he was finally free, until the day he came home from work and found an envelope on his desk. There was no sender, just the coin, clean, shiny, and with a new engraving beneath the symbol, "Promises don't end, they just change." Guardians. Daniel's terror was no longer in the coin itself. It was in the certainty that it had chosen him, not as owner, but as guardian of an oath he never made, but which he needed to protect until the true debtor awoke, or until someone willingly and voluntarily agreed to take his place. Daniel could no longer sleep soundly. With each attempt to get rid of the coin, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. After so many strange coincidences, a layoff, a breakup, minor accidents, he realized he needed to understand what the coin really was. It couldn't just be superstition. There was something bigger going on. One night, sitting at the kitchen table, Daniel lit a candle and placed the coin in the center. He grabbed a magnifying glass and his laptop and began searching for symbols similar to those carved there. It was an old coin, its face already worn, but on the reverse was something striking. An interlocking circle with two closed eyes in the center and a spiral symbol below. For hours, he browsed obscure internet forums, esoteric symbology sites, and antiquity records, and then he found something. A symbol very similar to that of the coin appeared in documents related to covenants of promise, in spiritual traditions of ancient Armenia, and protection rituals performed by religious wanderers in the Caucasus. According to the records, the object was given to someone as a symbol of commitment. It would protect the bearer as long as they never used it in trivial transactions. It was a seal of allegiance, not an ordinary coin. Daniel felt a chill. He remembered that afternoon as a teenager when he'd met the wanderer. He remembered the intense expression on his face, the words, "She's worth more than she seems. She protects, but demands that you never trade her for anything ordinary." And that was when it hit him. Daniel had broken the pact. Feeling a strange urgency, he began rummaging through old family boxes. He wanted to understand if anyone before him had also come into contact with the coin or this type of symbol. At the bottom of a forgotten wooden box in the attic, he found a notebook belonging to his great-grandfather, a man he had barely known, but who had a reputation as a country healer. Leafing through the notebook, he found disjointed passages written in shaky handwriting with phrases like, "She's back," and "I shouldn't use it." The coin bears the name of the one who broke the promise. On one of the pages, a drawing identical to the coin symbol. His great-grandfather had also tried to get rid of it. Daniel then understood that the coin didn't choose randomly. It circulated for generations, testing, collecting, observing. It wasn't just an object. It was a spiritual link, a physical reminder of a debt that transcended time. The search for its origin didn't bring him comfort, it brought him burden. And in that moment, looking at the coin above the lit candle, he knew there was a pact to be honored, or, as his great-grandfather had written in an enigmatic final passage, "If you don't want to carry the weight, learn to respect what protects you." Daniel spent days trying to understand the coin's origins, delving into ancient books, obscure internet forums, and even talking to people who studied esoteric symbols. But it was when he remembered a seemingly insignificant detail that everything began to make sense. Deep in his memory, the wanderer's voice emerged, repeating not only that the coin was valuable, but also it protects, but demands that you never exchange it for anything common. At the time, Daniel had thought the phrase was just a strange remark from an eccentric man. He hadn't realized the weight of those words. Now, with so many strange occurrences linked to the coin, he finally understood that warning wasn't a suggestion. It was a rule, a spiritual rule, an invisible condition of a pact he never knew he'd accepted. By using the coin as change for a soda one random day, Daniel had broken this pact. He traded something that carried a mystical bond for something banal, and in doing so, he opened a loophole. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a series of demands. Daniel decided to test it. He held the coin between his palms, closed his eyes, and visualized the exact moment he received it. He tried to recall the wanderer's face, the words spoken, the expression in his eyes. At that moment, he felt something warm in his hands. The coin pulsed, as if responding to the memory. When he opened his eyes, he was not alone. Behind him, reflected in the bedroom mirror, was a hooded silhouette. Daniel turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The mirror, however, continued to reflect the presence. The figure was looking directly at him, and for the first time, the voice he hadn't heard since that day echoed clearly, "Broken promises don't disappear, they wait." The image vanished in seconds, leaving Daniel in a state somewhere between fear and lucidity. Now he knew the coin wasn't just an object. It was a bond, a spiritual contract sealed without his awareness. From that day forward, Daniel vowed never to carry the coin carelessly again. He made a small altar in his room with candles, a code word on old paper, and a cup of water and salt. It was an attempt to show respect, to restore what had been broken. Life seemed to return to normal. Things stopped going wrong. But one thing didn't change. Every time Daniel looked at the coin, it looked different. Some days more worn, others shinier, as if it were alive, reacting to his behavior. The forgotten warning was now clearer than ever. The coin did protect, but it exacted a harsh toll on every slip. And whoever received it, even without asking, became the guardian of something far greater than they could have imagined. Because certain promises weren't made just with words, they were made with soul. After realizing that the coin kept returning, as if it had a life of its own, Daniel began to feel deeply uneasy. He had already tried every possible way to get rid of it. On his first attempt, he threw the coin into a river during a trip to the countryside, thinking the current would carry it away, and with it, the strange occurrences. 2 days later, he found it on the floorboard of his car, as if it had returned on its own. Frightened, he decided to bury it in an abandoned park, in the middle of the night, wrapped in coarse salt and whispered prayers. He swore not to tell anyone about it. For a week, his life seemed to return to normal. He slept well, the nightmares disappeared, and for the first time in a long time, he no longer felt the suffocating sensation of being watched. But all it took was a simple touch to his coat pocket to find the coin again, dry, clean, and shiny. It was there, as if it had never left. Daniel sought out specialists. He went to a priest, who refused to bless the object, saying he sensed something that doesn't belong here. He then sought help from a spiritualist who tried to use incense and mantras to untie the energetic link, but the coin merely heated up and cracked a glass cup during the ritual. The man's words echoed in Daniel's mind. "This isn't just an object. It's a link to a debt you owe, whether you know it or not." Desperation grew. In a final attempt, Daniel decided to donate the coin. He placed it in an anonymous envelope and left it at a church. He returned home, feeling light. But when he woke the next day, he found the envelope on his pillow, open with the coin on top, and a note written in red letters, "You promised." The coin now felt like a part of him. Each attempt to escape only strengthened the bond. In a moment of exhaustion, Daniel wrote in his journal, "I have no choice anymore. She doesn't want to go. Maybe the problem was never the coin, but what it represents." As he wrote this, the coin fell from his pocket without him touching it, as if responding to his consciousness. And for the first time, Daniel understood this wasn't just luck or bad luck. The coin was a living symbol of an ancient spiritual pact, a contract not signed with ink, but sealed with intention. And contracts like that cannot be broken with impunity. Years had passed since Daniel had received that strange coin from a man on the road. He was no longer a boy, and despite everything he had experienced, the misfortunes each time he spent the coin, the inexplicable returns, the losses that accumulated like signs, he had resolved never to part with it again. He now guarded it with respect and fear, locked in a safe next to a small altar bearing symbols he had learned to respect, even if he didn't fully understand them. It was a grey autumn afternoon, on a business trip through a small rural town, that something happened. Daniel's car broke down, ironically on the side of a country road very similar to the one where it all began. As if fate had deliberately recreated the scene, he got out of the car and walked to the shade of a tree. That's when he saw it. At the side of the road, a man sat, his posture relaxed, his hat covering his face, just like the wanderer of the past. Heart racing, Daniel approached slowly, trying not to make a sound. "You're back," the man said without looking up. His voice was calm, but it held an icy certainty that made him shiver. "Or maybe you never really left." Daniel approached, trying to understand. The man took off his hat. He was different from the original wanderer, but his eyes were the same. Eyes that seemed to have lived 1,000 lives. The eyes of someone who not only knew but waited for him. "The coin," the man said. "Is it still with you?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply took a small dark cloth from his inside jacket pocket, and from it, the coin. Even after so many years, the object still glowed subtly, its strange symbols pulsing in the afternoon light. The man smiled. "The coin finds its debtor," he repeated, as if quoting a sacred truth. "You didn't receive it by chance. You received it because someone of your own blood broke the original covenant. You carry that inheritance, Daniel." The name spoken without being revealed. The weight of the words descended upon him with force. Daniel then understood. It wasn't just about him. The coin wasn't a gift, it was a warning, an inherited bond, a debt no one had paid, and which he had unconsciously accepted when he agreed to keep it. "Can I break the bond?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. The man looked at him seriously. "You can honor it, you can protect it, you can pay with silence or with choice, but breaking it, no, because there are things that were never meant to be undone." A sharp wind blew across the road. When Daniel blinked, the man was gone. No footprints, no trace, just the coin still in his hand, now slightly warm, as if it had absorbed the last words spoken there. Deep down, he knew their reunion had not been a coincidence. Back in the Yi city, Daniel searched for answers. He understood that the man was a promise keeper, spiritual entities that emerge as living reminders of ancient commitments made by ancestors. Daniel was now part of this cycle. And the coin? He still had it, but he never tried to use it again. He simply revered it in silence, because he understood some spiritual debts are not meant to be forgotten, but to be remembered by those who have the courage to bear them. Daniel had lost count of how many times he'd tried to get rid of the coin. He'd buried it, thrown it into the sea, left it in cemeteries, burned it, or thought he'd burned it, but it always returned. In the pocket of an old coat, at the bottom of the backpack, he was sure he'd emptied, or even on his pillow, as if it had been placed there overnight. The coin wouldn't go away, and now he'd accepted it. There was a bond between them, something much greater than simple superstition. After reuniting with the Wanderer, or someone exactly like him, Daniel understood that the coin was more than an object. It was a guardian of a promise he hadn't known he'd made, but one he'd accepted the moment he received it without question. It protects but demands that you never exchange it for anything common. Those words now echoed within him like an inverted prayer. Over the years, Daniel adapted to his new reality. He built a small altar inside his home, a space reserved solely for the coin, surrounded by candles, protective symbols, and a journal where he recorded all the strange events that occurred when it disappeared. He discovered that, as long as he respected its presence, his life progressed in relative peace. There were no extraordinary gains, but there were no devastating losses either. It was as if the universe kept him in balance, as long as the coin was in its place. One night, feeling a strange urge to donate the coin to an institution that cares for mystical objects, Daniel decided to give it a try. He picked up the coin with tweezers, placed it in a small wooden case, and took it home. Upon arriving, he was greeted by a man who immediately refused the object. "This doesn't belong in our collection. It belongs to you." Even without knowing the reason, Daniel understood that the coin could not be passed on. The promise was his. The connection was personal. It was a sign of a pact that cannot be broken simply by distance, and with every attempt to ignore it, life exacted its toll. Doubly so. It was then that he created the ritual safe, a sealed box with hand-engraved symbols kept in a secret compartment of the house. Since placing the coin there, wrapped in red cloth and coarse salt, he never tried to use it again. He never let it disappear. And for a long time, things remained stable. But from time to time, the safe would vibrate slightly, as if the coin were breathing. Daniel realized that the balance wasn't permanent. It was merely a pause between cycles. The pact that had been sealed, whether with that wanderer, with the energy contained in the coin, or with something deeper, hadn't been broken. It had merely gone dormant. On specific nights, especially when Daniel was tempted to return to his old routine or considered using the coin for something small, the atmosphere in the house would change. The coin would heat up, the clock would slow down, the mirrors would form a thin layer of fog, even without steam. It was a silent reminder. Broken promises take their toll. Always. Deep down, Daniel already knew. That coin was never about luck. It was about commitment. And even though he couldn't remember the exact moment he accepted the promise, he now understood that his life was intertwined with it, forever.